It was on one of those murky November evenings, when the fog crept in from the Thames like a living entity, that I first encountered a mystery so singular that I have yet to cease marvelling at it. The gas lamps along Baker Street glimmered with a diffident glow, casting long, wavering shadows that seemed to follow me as I hurried home from my late rounds at St. Bartholomew's. My mind, weary from the incessant demands of my patients, found itself unexpectedly invigorated by the knowledge that Mr. Sherlock Holmes awaited me, as ever, in our sitting room, hunched over his chemical experiments or, more likely, poring over some newspaper of negligible interest to anyone but himself. I entered the familiar rooms of 221B with a sense of ritual comfort. Holmes was, as I had come to expect, seated in his high-backed chair, a thin wisp of smoke curling from a long clay pipe, his eyes fixed upon a sheet of paper which he perused with a concentrated intensity that seemed almost unnatural. A low murmur of the fire, the occasional creak of the floorboards, and the distant clatter of a hansom cab upon the cobblestones made up the modest symphony of our evening. "Ah, Watson," he said without lifting his gaze, "you were punctual tonight. Curious, is it not, how the clock governs all but the keen observer?" I smiled, accustomed to his occasional abstractions. "I have been delayed merely by the fog. One must take care not to tumble into a ditch or collide with a cabman's impatience." Holmes finally looked up, his sharp, penetrating eyes briefly fixing upon me before returning to his papers. "Indeed, the fog is not merely atmospheric, it conceals, it misleads, and it provides perfect cover for those whose intentions are less than noble. And speaking of noble intentions, Watson, I believe we shall shortly be visited by a gentleman whose troubles may very well stretch the boundaries of ordinary deduction." Before I could inquire further, a knock sounded upon the door, measured and urgent. Mrs. Hudson, whose patience with our eccentricities was of a saintly sort, admitted a visitor of some evident distress. He was a man of middling height, impeccably dressed in the manner of a gentleman accustomed to ease, though there was a pallor to his complexion that suggested recent anxieties. His eyes darted about the room as though he feared invisible observers, and I noted the twitching of his left hand, a subtle sign of nervous anticipation. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," he began, his voice strained, "I am in desperate need of assistance. Scotland Yard has been less than helpful, I fear, and I was advised that you, Mr. Holmes, have a particular aptitude for matters of perplexing complexity." Holmes inclined his head slightly, the corner of his mouth twitching in what I suspected was either amusement or contempt occasionally. It was impossible to distinguish which. "Pray take a seat, sir. We shall make the best of what time we have. But first, a few particulars, names, dates, circumstances. Begin at the beginning, if you would be so kind." The gentleman, who introduced himself as Mr. Reginald Ashcombe, hesitated, then took a chair by the fire. He fumbled with his gloves before speaking, as though the act of holding them lent him courage. It is my sister, Miss Helena Ashcombe. She has vanished from her London residence under circumstances which the police deem..." Yet I cannot accept such a conclusion. There are oddities, things that suggest more than mere absence." Holmes leaned forward, the firelight catching his hawk-like features, and I could see the faintest spark of anticipation in his eyes. "Oddities, you say? Do you mean peculiar behavior preceding her disappearance, or something observed at the scene?" "A portrait," Mr. Ashcombe replied, his voice lowering almost to a whisper. "A portrait of my late mother in her sitting room. It is hollow. I do not mean to suggest a peculiarity of framing or artistic technique. No, it is empty. When I approached it last night to inquire of my sister's whereabouts, I found that the back of the frame was accessible in a manner that is unnatural. I believe it conceals something that my sister may have discovered, or something which she may have been forced to remove herself." Holmes' eyes gleamed now, a certain excitement playing about his features that I have learned to recognize as prelude to the labyrinthine journeys of his intellect. "Fascinating. An empty recess, you say? It is often in such trifles that one finds the keys to the entire puzzle. Pray continue." Mr. Ashcombe did so, narrating a tale of minor household disturbances, unexplained sounds, and subtle hints that Helena had been visited by a shadowy figure in the weeks preceding her disappearance. Scotland Yard, for their part, had treated the matter as a mere domestic concern, attributing the noises to natural causes and dismissing the portrait as a relic of family sentimentality. But Holmes was not so easily placated. I watched him, fascinated, as he rose and moved to examine the very photograph which Mr. Ashcombe had brought. A small sketch of the Ashcombe drawing room, noting every minuscule detail with an intensity that was almost painful to witness. "There is significance in minutiae, Watson," he murmured, almost to himself. "The angle of this frame, the manner in which it is hung, even the faintest trace of dust and friction, these are the language of the household. And here, in this sketch, I perceive a clue that has eluded even the most diligent of Scotland Yard's inspectors." He beckoned Mr. Ashcombe closer. "Have you noticed, sir, the small irregular smudge along the base of the frame, or the faint impression of a finger upon the varnish? Such details suggest a recent tampering. Someone has engaged with this portrait in a manner that is secretive, yet precise. We must examine this in situ." I felt my pulse quicken. It had been some time since I had observed Holmes' faculties ignite in such a fashion. The promise of a mystery subtle, cunning, and apparently impenetrable filled the room with a peculiar electricity. We would depart immediately, he declared, to Ashcombe House, and there, I sensed, the first truly telling clues of this case would be revealed. As we stepped into the fog-laden streets, the gas lamps barely piercing the London gloom, I could not help but reflect upon the curious manner in which these things unfold. A vanished sister, a hollow portrait, an elusive figure in the shadows already. The outlines of a tangled enigma were visible, though its true form remained obscure. Holmes walked ahead with his customary stride, indifferent to the cold and damp, while I, loyal companion and chronicler, followed with pen and notebook at the ready. I knew then, with a certainty that has rarely failed me, that we were embarking upon one of those adventures which, once undertaken, can never be forgotten. The fog thickened, curling around the wheels of the passing hansoms and clinging to the edges of my coat. Somewhere, a distant bell tolled, marking the hour with an unyielding precision that contrasted sharply with the chaos of human affairs. And as the shadowy form of Ashcombe House emerged from the mist, I sensed, as both physician and observer, that the ordinary rules of deduction would be taxed to their very limits. Holmes glanced at me briefly, a half-smile playing upon his lips. "Watson, this is no mere trifle of domesticity. This case will require patience, ingenuity, and a keen eye for the smallest of inconsistencies. Are you prepared for what lies ahead?" I nodded, though my pulse betrayed the mixture of apprehension and exhilaration that filled me. "As always, Holmes. Lead the way." And so we approached the house, a venerable structure of stone and shadow, behind whose walls the first threads of a most curious and confounding mystery awaited us. The chill of the November evening seemed to seep into my bones as we made our way up the stone steps of Ashcombe House. Holmes' stride remained unhurried, yet purposeful, as if he were already cataloguing every detail of the building in his mind. The front door, a heavy oak structure adorned with a brass knocker shaped like a lion's head, opened at our knock to reveal a maid of most genteel bearing, whose expression betrayed the faintest trace of apprehension. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," she said, her voice. "Mr. Ashcombe told me to expect you. Please, to be careful, my lady. She has been most—" Holmes inclined his head with a polite, though somewhat distant, gravity. "Thank you, Miss Fletcher, sir. Emily Fletcher. Miss Fletcher, lead us to the drawing room. We shall inspect the portrait immediately." As we passed through the dimly lit hall, the glow of gas lamps reflected upon polished wood and brass fixtures, and I could not help but notice how carefully each object seemed to occupy its space, as if the entire house were a theatre set, designed with precision, yet concealing layers of untold stories. Holmes' eyes moved constantly, noting the position of furniture, the direction of shadows, the faintest trace of dust upon the skirting boards. The drawing room itself was large, though somewhat austere, with high ceilings and heavy curtains that partially obscured the fading light of the evening. At its center, positioned above a marble mantelpiece, hung the portrait which had so disturbed Mr. Ashcombe. A matronly woman in late middle age, with dark eyes and a serene expression, gazed down from the canvas. Yet there was an oddity, a small, nearly imperceptible gap between the frame and the wall, and a faint dark smudge along the lower edge, which seemed almost deliberate. Holmes approached with a slow, deliberate gait. He crouched slightly, eyes narrowing, and tapped gently upon the base of the frame. A soft, hollow echo responded. "Curious," he murmured. "Watson, observe. The frame is not firmly affixed to the wall. It is designed to conceal something. A compartment perhaps, or a mechanism of some sort. Notice also the irregularities along the varnish here. He gestured to the lower edge where a fingerprint had left a barely discernible impression. I leaned closer, my physician's eyes trained to notice even the faintest anomaly. Indeed, Holmes, but surely the matter is of little consequence. It may simply be a relic, an old frame loosened over time. Holmes gave a low, sardonic chuckle, the sound more a ripple of amusement than genuine laughter. Ah, my dear Watson, you underestimate the importance of trifles. It is often in the smallest irregularity that one finds the grandest truths. Observe the wear upon this section of the frame. It is recent and deliberate. Someone has engaged with this portrait not by accident, but with intention. He rose, producing from his coat pocket a small magnifying glass, which he held close to the frame's edge. I watched him examine every joint, every groove, every imperceptible notch. The intensity of his scrutiny was almost hypnotic, and I could not help but marvel at how entirely his mind could absorb such detail while ignoring the obvious distractions of the room. After several minutes of careful observation, he stepped back, eyes alight with the spark of discovery. Watson, I believe we shall find that this hollow is more than mere peculiarity. It is, I suspect, a receptacle designed to conceal something of considerable value or perhaps something of considerable danger. Before I could respond, a faint sound reached my ears, a soft, almost imperceptible click, as though a mechanism had been engaged. I glanced about nervously, noting that no one else seemed to have moved. Holmes, however, merely arched a single eyebrow, his expression one of calm anticipation. "Ah," he said, crouching once more. "The portrait is not merely hollow. It is secured by a mechanical catch, likely spring-operated. Miss Fletcher, would you be so kind as to allow me access to the key if one exists?" The maid produced a small brass key from a ribbon around her neck, handing it over with shaking hands. Holmes inserted it carefully into a barely visible keyhole at the side of the frame. There was a soft click, and the frame swung forward slightly, revealing a shallow cavity behind. Within it lay a small velvet-lined compartment containing a folded bundle of papers, tied with a faded ribbon. "Watson," Holmes whispered, his voice almost reverent, "observe. Here lies the first true clue of this curious affair. These papers, I suspect, will explain both the disappearance of Miss Helena and the reason why Scotland Yard has been so entirely unhelpful. Their contents, however, must be examined with care. Any hasty move might alert an observer or, worse, a criminal intent upon reclaiming them." I moved closer as Holmes carefully extracted the bundle. The papers were old, with edges yellowed and corners frayed, yet the handwriting was deliberate, even elegant. The first page bore a single word in flowing script, Ashcombe. Beneath it, a series of cryptic annotation dates, initials, and what appeared to be coded references to locations within the house. Holmes' eyes gleamed with recognition. "Watson, I am confident that these notes are not merely personal reflections. They are instructions or warnings. Someone wished to conceal information here, and the choice of a portrait, rather than a drawer or safe, indicates the value of secrecy over security." I found myself trembling slightly, aware that we had touched the very nerve of a mystery that promised danger and intrigue. And yet, as Holmes carefully replaced the frame and restored the key to Miss Fletcher, his composure remained flawless, as if every step, no matter how delicate, was guided by an unerring hand. "Now, my dear Watson," he said, straightening and fixing me with one of his piercing looks, "we must question the household. Each individual, no matter how minor their role, may hold a vital piece of the puzzle. Start with Miss Fletcher. She has seen much more than she realizes. Then we shall speak with Mr. Ashcombe himself. And finally, we must consider the peculiar habits of the missing Miss Helena. The mind of a woman in distress, or a woman compelled by curiosity, may reveal truths that even the most cunning observer could not predict." We spent the next hour interrogating Miss Fletcher, who described in meticulous, though nervous, detail the comings and goings of the household. She mentioned fleeting shadows glimpsed in the hallways, the faint tapping at the windows late at night, and most curiously, the sudden disappearance of a small jewelry case the week prior, a detail that had been ignored by the police. Holmes listened, interjecting only when necessary, his questions precise and disarming. Every answer seemed to add layers of intrigue rather than dispel them, and I found myself marveling at his ability to draw significance from minutiae invisible to ordinary observation. Finally, after hearing Miss Fletcher's account, Holmes motioned for silence. He turned to me, the faintest smile playing upon his lips. "Watson, we are now at the threshold of this mystery. The hollow portrait, the concealed papers, the restless maid, and the vanished lady, they form a web. Scotland Yard may think the matter trivial, but I perceive the first threads of an intricate design. We must proceed with caution, for the next move may well be observed, and not all eyes are friendly." As we prepared to leave the room, the gas lamps flickering against the fading daylight, I could not help but feel that we had, at last, glimpsed the first true contour of a mystery that promised danger, deceit, and a cunning adversary. The hollow portrait was no mere curiosity, it was a warning, a message, and perhaps a key to locating Miss Helena Ashcombe herself. Outside, the fog had thickened, curling about the corners of the house and cloaking the world in shadow. Holmes walked silently to the carriage, lost in thought. I, notebook in hand, could only marvel at the precision of his mind, already 3 steps ahead of any ordinary observer. Somewhere in that house the secrets of the Ashcombe family lay waiting, and I had little doubt that the next revelation would challenge both our intellect and our courage. Thus ended our first formal examination of Ashcombe House, though I sensed that this evening, the prelude to a far more complex series of events had only just begun. The night air had a dampness that clung to one's clothing, and the fog that enveloped Baker Street had followed us even to the outskirts of the Ashcombe estate. After our initial examination of the drawing room and the hollow portrait, I was eager, though I confess, somewhat apprehensive to witness how Holmes would pursue the investigation further. There was a method to his silence, a patience that could try one's nerves, but I had learned, through experience, that it was precisely this method which allowed him to observe the minutiae invisible to others. We had retired briefly to a small study on the ground floor, where the flicker of a solitary lamp cast long shadows upon the walls. Holmes, as usual, seated himself with a certain stillness that contrasted sharply with the restlessness in my own mind. He carefully unfolded the bundle of papers we had retrieved from behind the portrait, arranging them with exacting precision upon the desk. Each sheet bore cryptic notes, initials, and a small, almost indecipherable series of sketches. "Watson," he said finally, not lifting his eyes from the papers, "the arrangement of these symbols and annotations suggests a map of the house, or, more precisely, the sequence of movements within it. Observe here, at the corner of this sheet, a mark indicating what appears to be the servants' corridor. And here," he continued, pointing to a small arrow beneath a series of initials, "the location of a secondary door, concealed behind a tapestry. Whoever placed these notes anticipated careful observers, or perhaps a family member with knowledge of clandestine habits." I bent closer, attempting to decipher the cryptic markings. "It almost reads like a set of instructions or a warning," I remarked. "Do you believe Miss Helena followed these, or did she merely discover them?" Holmes finally looked up, his expression revealing the faintest trace of something approaching amusement. "Ah, my dear Watson, that is the question, and the answer is rarely what one first presumes. Miss Helena, like many women of intelligence, likely approached this matter with both curiosity and caution. But there is something else, something subtle, hidden not in the notes but in the very arrangement of the room itself. We left the study to explore further, our steps muffled upon the thick rugs that lined the corridors. The house, though well appointed, possessed an atmosphere of quiet tension, as though each room were holding its breath, awaiting some inevitable revelation. Holmes paused frequently, examining door frames, peering behind draperies, and noting the faint scuffs upon the floor. It was in the servants' corridor that the first real anomaly presented itself. Holmes halted suddenly, crouching and pointing to a small, barely perceptible scratch along the wall near a secondary door. The scratch appeared to be recent, and yet precise, almost as though someone had sought to test the mechanism behind the panel without drawing attention. "Observe, Watson," Holmes whispered. "This is no accident. The door itself is designed to be hidden, yet this mark betrays its existence. Miss Helena, or an intruder, has found it or attempted to find it. Either scenario is of consequence." We pressed forward, moving carefully through the narrow corridor until Holmes located the door concealed behind a tapestry depicting a pastoral scene. With a deft push, the panel swung open to reveal a small, dimly lit chamber, scarcely larger than a closet. Within, the air was heavy with the scent of old paper and wood polish. On a simple shelf rested several volumes, but it was the small locked cabinet in the corner that drew Holmes' attention immediately. Holmes examined the lock with his usual meticulous care. "A delicate mechanism," he murmured. "Certainly not of ordinary manufacture. Whoever installed this wished to conceal its contents from casual observation. And yet, there is a telltale wear on the latch. Someone has attempted entry recently." Before we could investigate further, a sudden sound startled me, a faint footstep echoing from the upper floor. Holmes froze, listening with an intensity that made the air around us feel taut. The step was deliberate, measured, but cautious, as if the intruder wished to avoid detection. "Watson," Holmes said softly, "we are not alone, and I suspect that this visitor is connected, directly or indirectly, to Miss Helena's disappearance." We waited in silence, the shadows of the chamber pressing close, until a figure emerged at the top of the stairwell. It was a man middle-aged, with a thin face and nervous eyes. His attire was that of a gentleman, yet there was an air of unease, as though he were ill at ease in his own skin. "Mr. Holmes," he said, his voice strained. I did not anticipate your presence here." Holmes' eyes never wavered from the man. "And yet you are here. Pray, identify yourself and the purpose of your visit to Ashcombe House at this late hour." The man swallowed nervously. "I am Charles Marston, a friend of the family, or at least an acquaintance. I had reason to believe that something was amiss, and I wished to offer my assistance." Holmes' gaze sharpened. "Assistance, you say? And yet you approach at a time when the household is presumably at rest. Curious indeed. Tell me, Mr. Marston, did you see Miss Helena on the evening of her disappearance?" Marston hesitated, glancing about as if seeking an escape route that did not exist. "I did not, but I have heard things. Rumors, perhaps, yet I thought it prudent to investigate before speaking to the authorities." Holmes nodded slowly, steepling his fingers. "Rumors are often the first thread of truth, and yet many are intentionally misleading. Tell me, Mr. Marston, are you aware of this hidden door in its cabinet?" Marston's eyes widened, a flicker of alarm passing across his features. Holmes' voice grew sharper, almost sardonic. "Curious. And yet you have appeared at this hour, in this corridor, and you claim ignorance of its existence. Pray, Mr. Marston, do you expect me to accept such coincidence?" The man stammered, clearly unsettled. "I merely sought to ensure the house was secure. I meant no intrusion." Holmes' eyes gleamed with a quiet intensity. "Watson, note the subtle inconsistencies. His attire, his hesitation, the nervous twitch of his hand, and most of all, his choice to appear here rather than report through ordinary channels. Every one of these observations suggests a motive that is, at best, suspect." I felt a chill, realizing that the first apparent witness or friend might be more than he seemed. The game had begun in earnest. Already, a tangle of intrigue, secrecy and misdirection was emerging from the ordinary trappings of a stately household. Holmes turned his gaze back to me, his expression a mixture of satisfaction and intensity. "Watson, we must proceed with extreme care. Shadows often conceal truths, but they also conceal dangers. Mr. Marston's presence is no accident, and the first false leads of this case are beginning to take shape. Observe carefully, for in the minutiae lies revelation." As we withdrew from the concealed chamber, the faint echo of our footsteps mingling with the distant groan of the old house, I could not help but feel that we had only glimpsed the surface of a far deeper mystery. The hollow portrait, the secret cabinet, the mysterious Mr. Marston, all were threads weaving a web far more intricate than I could yet perceive. And I knew, with a mix of anticipation and dread, that the night had only just begun to unfold its secrets. The events of the previous night continued to occupy my thoughts even as the dawn crept pale and uncertain across London. Ashcombe House, with its secrets and shadows, lingered in my mind like a dream half-remembered, stirring a sense of both curiosity and unease. Holmes, as usual, seemed immune to the chill or the fog of morning, already at work over his notes when I entered our sitting room at Baker Street. He did not glance up immediately, his eyes scanning the pages with the precision of a surgeon examining a patient. "Ah, Watson," he said at last, his tone light but edged with intensity. "Do you know the value of first impressions? The mind, when guided correctly, can reconstruct events from the faintest traces. You will find, in the case of Ashcombe House, that the first puzzle lies not in what is overt, but in what is deliberately concealed. I seated myself, pen in hand, eager to hear his analysis. And what is your impression, Holmes? Is Mr. Marston to be regarded as friend or obstacle? Holmes leaned back, fingers steepled, eyes glinting with their characteristic sharpness. He is neither wholly friend nor entirely foe, Watson, but he is certainly a factor and anomaly to be accounted for. Observe the details of his conduct last night, the delay in reporting, the nervous hesitation, the careful attention to the hidden chamber all point to a man who wishes to appear innocent, yet whose awareness exceeds the average observer. We shall need to tread carefully, for he may yet prove troublesome. I scribbled notes furiously, conscious that even the slightest oversight could obscure the subtle hints that Holmes so deftly uncovered. And the portrait? I asked. Do you believe the papers we found are connected to Miss Helena's disappearance? Holmes gave a faint smile. Indubitably. The arrangement of the notes, their deliberate concealment behind a hollow portrait, speaks to both secrecy and urgency. Someone feared that the contents might fall into the wrong hands. Whether that someone is the missing lady herself or another agent remains to be seen. The papers indicate internal knowledge accessible only to those familiar with the house's layout and the family's affairs. Determined to act upon Holmes' reasoning, we returned to Ashcombe House in the late morning. The fog had lifted slightly, leaving the city damp and glistening, the streets slick beneath the wheels of passing cabs. Upon our arrival, Holmes requested to speak privately with Mr. Ashcombe, while I remained with Miss Fletcher, who now seemed more composed in the daylight, though a nervous tension lingered about her features. Dr. Watson, she whispered, there is something you must understand. Mr. Marston, he is not quite as he seems. There have been subtle incidents, small disagreements, and matters left unexplained. He is persistent in ways that trouble me. I noted her words carefully, for Holmes often emphasized that the observations of those close to her household could be as telling as any physical clue. While she spoke, I could not help but glance toward the portrait once more, its silent gaze seeming almost to regard me with quiet judgment. Holmes and Mr. Ashcombe returned shortly thereafter, their conversation concluded. Holmes' expression, as always, was unreadable. He motioned for me to follow him to the drawing room. Once there, he produced the papers from our previous inspection, spreading them carefully across the mantelpiece. Observe, Watson, he began. These annotations are far from random. The dates correspond to events in the household, the initials mark specific individuals, and the sequences suggest movement patterns. The creator of these notes intended to communicate without revealing, to conceal without leaving trace. Yet, the hand is hesitant at times, betraying emotion, perhaps fear. Note here the insertion of a small symbol resembling a crescent moon. It recurs in several locations. I leaned in, tracing the symbol with my finger. Could it be a code or a signpost? Holmes' eyes sparkled. Both, potentially. It is a signal to someone aware of its significance. And notice the faint pencil marks, corrections, erasures, and minute smudges. The author, while careful, left these inadvertent signs which an observant mind can interpret. I suspect Miss Helena had access to these papers, yet there is evidence of a third party, one who has tampered with them after her disappearance. My pulse quickened. A third party? You mean an intruder or someone close to the family? Holmes inclined his head. Precisely. And the presence of Mr. Marston last night complicates the matter. Whether he is complicit or merely curious, he has knowledge that may assist or hinder our investigation. Our task, Watson, is to disentangle the threads of intention from the threads of deception. At that moment, a faint sound drifted from the hallway footsteps, measured and deliberate. Holmes' eyes narrowed. Watson, remain here. He moved with the grace and silence of a stalking predator, pausing at the doorway to listen. I followed quietly, aware that any sound might betray our presence. The footsteps ceased abruptly, and a shadow flickered across the far wall, a figure moving swiftly, perhaps retreating. Holmes' voice was a whisper, an observer or the source of disturbance. In either case, it confirms the presence of an active agent within the house. Note, Watson, how the intruder avoids the main corridors, favoring the concealed paths indicated in the notes. This is not mere coincidence. They are guided by knowledge. We pursued briefly, but the figure had vanished, leaving only the faintest impressions on the carpet and the subtle aroma of cigars, an unmistakable mark of a visitor who wished to remain unseen, yet inadvertently revealed themselves. Holmes examined the traces with precision, his eyes tracing the minute details that would escape any ordinary observer. "Watson," he murmured, "the case deepens. We have now identified 3 key elements: the hidden papers, Miss Helena's disappearance, and an unknown agent moving within the household. Each element intersects with the others, forming a puzzle that is at once intricate and dangerous. Scotland Yard, with their conventional methods, would miss the connections entirely. But for us, the challenge lies in interpreting what is hidden rather than what is shown. As the day waned and shadows lengthened across the drawing room, I could not help but marvel at the elegance of Holmes' mind. The puzzle was already beginning to take shape, and yet I sensed that the most confounding elements remained unseen. Somewhere within Ashcombe House, the truth lingered, obscured by secrecy, fear, and subtle deception. I sat by the fire that evening, reflecting upon the day's discoveries, while Holmes busied himself with careful notes and sketches. The hollow portrait, the secret compartment, the mysterious Mr. Marston, and the vanished Miss Helena all had begun to reveal the outlines of a far more complex intrigue than I had anticipated. And as the gas lamps flickered and the fog pressed close against the windows, I understood that this case would test every faculty of observation and deduction that Holmes possessed, and perhaps even those of his faithful chronicler. The morning after our brief pursuit of the shadowy figure in Ashcombe House dawned with the grey, wet light that is so characteristic of London in late November. The fog had not yet lifted, and the streets outside the carriage windows seemed shrouded in an opaque veil, lending a sense of isolation to our journey. Holmes, as always, was lost in thought, his sharp eyes occasionally flicking toward a passing hansom or the glimmer of a shop window, as though some insignificant detail might reveal the solution to our unfolding mystery. I had not yet recovered my own sense of calm after the previous evening's events. The hidden papers, the mysterious cabinet, the sudden appearance of Mr. Charles Marston, and the vanishing Miss Helena all combined into a labyrinthine puzzle that resisted the casual scrutiny of the untrained mind. Holmes, however, appeared unperturbed, and I found myself once more in awe of his composure. Upon our arrival at Baker Street, Holmes dismissed the carriage with a mere gesture and turned to me with his characteristic intensity. "Watson, we have observed, catalogued, and pursued. Now we must scrutinize human behavior. The first inconsistency in Mr. Marston's account has presented itself, though he remains blissfully unaware of the scrutiny he faces." I raised my eyebrows, intrigued. "And what, pray, is this inconsistency?" I confess that my mind is still grappling with the multitude of details we have encountered. Holmes produced a small notebook in which he had meticulously recorded every statement, gesture, and hesitation of Mr. Marston. He tapped the page with a long forefinger. "Notice here, Watson, the timeline of his movements on the evening of Miss Helena's disappearance. He claims to have arrived at the Ashcombe estate at precisely 8 o'clock, having travelled from his own residence in Mayfair. Yet, the concierge at his lodging observed him leaving at 20 minutes past 8. Furthermore, a hansom driver from the route corroborates a later departure. Simple arithmetic reveals that his account is impossible." I leaned forward, astonished at the clarity of his observation. And yet he persisted, almost insistently, in maintaining that schedule. Holmes smiled faintly, the expression both sardonic and approving. "Indeed, the conviction with which one lies often betrays the lie itself. It is not merely the discrepancy in time that concerns me, Watson, but the psychological implication. Mr. Marston wishes us to believe in a false chronology, one that conceals the precise period during which he could have acted or observed without detection." I made a note of this, though I could feel the knot of unease tightening in my stomach. "You mean to suggest that he may have been at the house earlier than he admits?" Holmes' eyes glimmered. "Precisely. And note the subtle, almost imperceptible manner in which he avoided the servants' corridor, the very corridor where the hidden cabinet resides. A man conscious of observation treads carefully, but a man who wishes to conceal prior presence moves with deliberate avoidance. Mr. Marston has done both." I felt a chill. The implications were serious. And the papers? Could he have had access to them? Holmes rose and walked to the window, eyes tracing the fog-shrouded street below. It is likely. The concealment behind the portrait was clever, yet it was not impregnable. Anyone with knowledge of the house's layout and, crucially, the timing of its inhabitants' movements could access it without detection. This is why I am particularly concerned with the intersection of opportunity and intention. Observation alone does not convict a man, but observation of inconsistencies does. We returned to Ashcombe House later that day, ostensibly to follow up with Mr. Ashcombe and gather further context regarding the family's movements. Holmes immediately requested to speak privately with the master of the house. I remained with Miss Fletcher, whose unease had grown more pronounced. She seemed restless, pacing the drawing room in a manner that suggested both worry and an unspoken reluctance to disclose certain facts. "Dr. Watson," she said quietly, "there is something more. Last night, I thought I saw Mr. Marston leave the corridor near the cabinet, but when I approached, the shadows had shifted, and he was nowhere to be found. I did not wish to speak of it, fearing, perhaps, that it was my imagination. But now, seeing you here, I feel compelled to tell you." Holmes' eyes flicked toward her, attentive yet controlled. "Miss Fletcher, your observation is most valuable. Even a fleeting glimpse, if accurate, provides evidence of presence. And it aligns with the inconsistency I have noted. Mr. Marston's account is flawed, not by accident, but by deliberate misrepresentation. I was beginning to feel the full weight of the case. The hollow portrait, the secret compartment, the hidden papers, and now a suspect whose very statements betrayed him each element, formed a lattice of intrigue and danger. Yet I sensed, as I often did, that Holmes was 3 steps ahead of me, seeing connections that I could barely comprehend. Holmes continued, speaking almost to himself as much as to me. "Watson, observe the methodology of concealment. A false chronology, avoidance of particular corridors, and selective disclosure to household staff all indicate premeditation. And premeditation, my dear Watson, is a powerful lens through which to view disappearance. Miss Helena is not merely absent. She has interacted with forces that sought to guide or mislead her. Our task is to untangle these threads before they tighten into something far more dangerous." I felt a shiver as the enormity of his words sank in. And yet I ventured, do we have any indication of motive? Why would Mr. Marston, if he is indeed involved, wish to mislead the household or interfere with the papers? Holmes' gaze sharpened. "The answer is rarely immediate, Watson. Motive is obscured, layered beneath social niceties and self-interest. Often the simplest explanation is a facade, behind which lies greed or fear. The papers are valuable not merely for their content, but for what they signify. Access to them grants leverage information that can alter fortunes, reputations, and even freedom. Mr. Marston's reluctance to admit presence during key moments is a strong indication that such leverage is at stake." The remainder of the day passed in careful observation. Holmes and I recorded the household movements, interrogated the servants discreetly, and inspected the cabinet once more for signs of tampering. Every detail, no matter how slight, seemed to carry weight, and I was beginning to appreciate the subtlety with which Holmes approached his craft. As evening fell, I found myself seated by the fire, reflecting upon the unfolding mystery. The inconsistencies in Mr. Marston's account were more than mere misstatements, they were deliberate signals, hidden in plain sight. The hidden cabinet, the hollow portrait, and the secret papers all formed a triad of clues that suggested a careful orchestration. And somewhere, in the midst of this carefully constructed web, Miss Helena remained, her fate yet uncertain. Holmes, meanwhile, sat silently across from me, eyes glinting with contemplative fire. "Watson," he said at last, "the first inconsistency is the opening move in a game far more elaborate than we have yet seen. We must observe without revealing, anticipate without action, and interpret without bias. The next steps, I suspect, will require both subtlety and courage." And with that, the first true veil had been lifted, revealing a hidden inconsistency that would guide our investigation toward truths as yet unimagined, and into dangers that neither Scotland Yard nor ordinary caution could have foreseen. The night that followed our discovery of Mr. Marston's inconsistency was, for London, a night thick with fog and portent. The gas lamps outside Baker Street struggled against the damp, drifting mists, casting a blurred glow upon the slick streets. Holmes, as was his wont, did not appear to sleep in the ordinary sense. He moved through the sitting room with restless precision, examining our notes, pacing the floor, and occasionally pausing to scrutinize a map of Ashcombe House that he had drawn from memory and observation. "I have considered the possibilities, Watson," he said abruptly, pausing mid-step. "Mr. Marston is of concern, certainly, but he is merely a facet of the problem. The true complication is unseen and deliberate. And I believe," he continued, his eyes glinting, "we shall see the second act of this mystery unfold tonight." I could scarcely imagine what he meant, but a sense of foreboding accompanied his words. The evening wore on, and at Holmes' suggestion, we returned once more to Ashcombe House, ostensibly to review the household's layout and movements. The servants, having become accustomed to our repeated visits, allowed us entrance with polite if nervous deference. As we reached the drawing-room, a sudden cry from the upper floor shattered the quiet, a high, piercing note, almost a shriek, that seemed to carry through the very walls. Holmes and I exchanged a glance, and without hesitation, we dashed up the main staircase, the echo of our boots mingling with another, lighter sound footsteps retreating swiftly into the gloom. Holmes paused at the threshold of Miss Helena's chamber, his eyes scanning for clues. "Watson, note the disarray," he said softly. "The bed has been disturbed, but nothing stolen. A window is ajar, though the locks remain intact. Observe the faint scuff marks upon the sill, and the impressions in the carpet near the door. Someone has entered and left in haste, yet deliberately avoided certain pathways. This is no ordinary intrusion." I examined the room, noting the overturned chair and the slight draught from the open window. "Could it be that Miss Helena has returned and left again in secret?" I ventured. Holmes shook his head. "Unlikely. A person so calculated would not leave evidence of a struggle, however minor. No, Watson, this is the work of a third party, someone who wishes to unsettle the household, perhaps to mask the movements of another, more significant intruder." We moved carefully through the corridor, Holmes' magnifying glass sweeping over every surface, while I attempted to catalogue the impressions of footfalls and the faint marks upon the wallpaper. It was in a corner near the servants' corridor that he paused, crouching, and touched a faint smear on the baseboard. "Watson," he whispered, "the smudge is fresh. Someone has recently used this route to access the hidden cabinet behind the portrait. And yet, there is no sign of the household staff's disturbance. The intruder is precise, calculated, and familiar with the layout. Note the similarity to the symbols in the papers." Before I could respond, a rustling sound emanated from the cabinet itself. Holmes drew a small hand lens, examining the lock, while I involuntarily reached for my medical bag, anticipating the worst. "Locked," Holmes murmured. "And yet, it has been manipulated recently. The faint impression of a handprint here, at this corner, delicate, almost feminine. Watson, I suspect Miss Helena's involvement, or at least her proximity to whoever has been accessing these papers." I could hardly keep pace with his deductions. "But Holmes," I protested, "if she is missing, how could her handprint be here? Unless—" Holmes held up a hand to silence me. "Precisely, Watson. Unless she has been compelled or followed by someone who wishes to suggest her presence, masking the true identity of the intruder. Observe, too, the dust upon the floor. The pattern of disruption is deliberate, designed to mislead an observer. Our first false trail is laid, and it is as clever as it is subtle." As we examined the cabinet, a sudden sound from the hall made me start, a low, almost inaudible whisper, followed by the distinct creak of floorboards above. Holmes froze, listening intently. "An observer remains," he murmured, "and this one is daring or desperate. Watson, we must act with caution." We moved silently toward the staircase, Holmes' hand lightly on my arm. The upper floor corridor was dimly lit, shadows pooling like ink beneath the waning gaslight. A figure darted past the doorway at the far end, quick, lithe, and cautious. Holmes' eyes narrowed. "Watson," he said, "the intruder seeks to remain unseen, yet their haste betrays their presence. Follow me, but maintain discretion. We must not force a confrontation prematurely." We pursued for several moments, following the faint impressions left on the carpet. The figure disappeared into a small storage room at the rear of the house. Holmes approached with the silent precision of a cat, opening the door slowly. The room was empty save for a few old trunks and a small desk, atop which lay a scrap of paper, hastily folded and abandoned. Holmes picked it up with gloved fingers, unfolding it carefully. "Watson, observe. This note was intended to be found, or, at the very least, to mislead. It bears a symbol familiar from the hollow portraits papers. Someone is using these symbols deliberately to suggest movement, presence, or intent. It is clever, yet ultimately superficial. I read over his shoulder. The note contained nothing more than cryptic phrases, references to times and locations, and an urgent warning. Do not follow, lest the path lead to ruin. Holmes smiled faintly, though his eyes remained sharp. A feint, Watson. A diversion intended to frighten, confuse, and misdirect. But no threat is sufficient to deter us. The intruder is bold but not infallible, and we now have proof of a second disturbance, deliberate, calculated, and directly linked to Miss Helena's disappearance. As we returned to the drawing room, the fog outside had thickened, and the gas lamps flickered with an uncertain light. The household, unaware of the intruder's presence or our pursuit, remained in a state of quiet unrest. I could feel the tension pressing upon us, a tangible force, as though the house itself were aware of the machinations within. Holmes turned to me, eyes gleaming with a mixture of anticipation and determination. Watson, this second disturbance confirms that we are dealing with a mind both careful and audacious. Each act, each misstep is a message, deliberate in its placement. Scotland Yard would dismiss it as mere coincidence. But for us, the challenge is to trace intention through absence, to read the invisible patterns in the shadows. The game is now in earnest, and its stakes are higher than ever. I shivered, realizing that the safe order and predictability of Ashcombe House had been irrevocably shattered. The hollow portrait, the secret cabinet, the inconsistencies of Mr. Marston, and now this second, deliberate intrusion all pointed to a mystery far more cunning, dangerous, and intricate than I had first imagined. And somewhere in that house, or perhaps outside it, Miss Helena remained, a silent axis around which a web of deception was rapidly spinning, drawing us inexorably into its center. The events of the preceding night left Ashcombe House in a state of quiet unease. The servants moved with cautious efficiency, glancing nervously toward the drawing room and the upper corridors, while Mr. Ashcombe himself seemed troubled by a weight that even his genteel composure could not conceal. Miss Fletcher, in particular, lingered in corners and doorways, her hands wringing ever so slightly, as though the very walls held secrets she dared not confront alone. Holmes, ever the observer, wasted no time. He had insisted that we remain in residence at Ashcombe House for the following days, ostensibly to catalogue household movements and survey the layout in detail. I soon realized, however, that this was a guise designed to allow him to manipulate circumstances with precision while keeping the household unaware of the depth of his scrutiny. It began with the subtle placement of objects. Holmes adjusted the angle of a chair here, the tilt of a lamp there, and the arrangement of small ornaments on a sideboard. I noted his meticulous attention to detail, though the purpose eluded me at first. "Watson," he murmured one morning, examining the alignment of a series of photographs, "the human mind is easily led by perception. We shall create a series of false trails. Mr. Marston is clever, but he is susceptible to suggestion. If we arrange the household in a predictable pattern, we can observe reactions, extract information, and perhaps even provoke a revealing slip." I watched, intrigued, as he moved silently among the rooms, leaving subtle hints of our presence and then retiring to a corner with quiet patience. His eyes never ceased their observant flicker, noting every shadow, every footstep, and every glance. The first false trail involved a letter carefully placed atop the cabinet where the hidden papers were kept. The envelope bore the familiar crescent symbol we had observed in the notes behind the hollow portrait, and it was addressed in Miss Helena's handwriting. Holmes explained in his typically sardonic tone that it was intended to provoke curiosity, fear, or even guilt. "It is a test, Watson," he said. "Observe how our players respond to evidence they believe is private. Reaction, my dear fellow, often reveals more than statements ever could. The intruder is guided by fear, misperception, or both. By carefully arranging the environment, we draw out these tendencies." As expected, the effect was immediate. Within hours, Mr. Marston was observed hovering near the cabinet, ostensibly casual, yet betraying subtle agitation. He examined the letter with exaggerated care, glanced toward the hallway, and even spoke in low tones to Miss Fletcher, who seemed startled by his attention. Holmes, meanwhile, observed from a distance, noting every detail with the intensity of a hawk. "Watson, note the hesitation in his movements, the repeated glances, the careful avoidance of direct contact with the cabinet itself. He wishes to appear unconcerned, yet his mind is entirely preoccupied. The deception is deliberate, but it cannot conceal the underlying motive. The second false trail involved a small, ornate box, which Holmes placed in a conspicuous corner of the drawing room. He instructed Miss Fletcher to mention casually, in passing, that it contained a few minor trinkets from the Ashcombe collection. The purpose, he explained, was to create an additional distraction, something tangible, accessible, and yet ultimately irrelevant. Within the day, the effect was predictable. Mr. Marston, previously preoccupied with the cabinet and the letter, shifted his attention to the box. He examined it, even attempted to open it, and then paused, as though uncertain whether the action would be noticed. Holmes' eyes gleamed at the subtle display. The human mind, he whispered to me, cannot resist temptation. The false trail exposes desire, priorities, and occasionally, intent. Each misstep, each glance, is a revelation if one knows where to look. Meanwhile, Miss Fletcher continued her discreet observations, offering her own insights under Holmes' gentle guidance. She noticed, for example, that certain servants lingered longer in corridors than necessary, or that a subtle draft in the hallway seemed to indicate tampering with doors and windows. These seemingly minor details were catalogued by Holmes with almost obsessive precision. By the second evening, it became clear that our measures were producing results. Mr. Marston appeared increasingly nervous, his movements deliberate yet punctuated by hesitations. He questioned servants with greater frequency, attempted to gauge the positions of objects, and even glanced repeatedly toward the concealed cabinet, as though torn between caution and curiosity. Holmes, for his part, remained composed, almost aloof, yet his mind worked with relentless energy. Watson observed the principle at work. By controlling the environment and providing cues, we manipulate behavior without force. The intruder is drawn to the false trails, revealing not only intent but capability. Each reaction is a clue, each hesitation a fragment of truth. I found myself fascinated by the elegance of his methods. While the household remained unaware of the subtleties of his manipulations, I could see, more clearly than ever, that Holmes' genius lay not merely in observation, but in the orchestration of perception itself. The misdirection, while seemingly a game, was designed to expose truth in a manner that brute force or conventional investigation could never achieve. And yet, even as the false trails began to yield their revelations, a shadow of unease persisted. Miss Helena remained missing, the intruder continued to operate unseen, and Mr. Marston's behavior suggested motives that were neither entirely innocent nor entirely transparent. The web of deception grew ever more intricate, and I could feel that the resolution of this first phase of the mystery was approaching, but not without further danger, confusion, and intrigue. Holmes, as I watched him move among the household staff, quietly noting reactions, gestures, and subtle expressions, finally turned to me with that characteristic glint in his eye. "Watson," he said softly, "the game is now in motion. False trails will unravel, truths will emerge, and the intruder, in their own cleverness, will provide the key to the puzzle. We must be patient but vigilant, for the first true misdirection is often the most revealing." As I retired to my own quarters that evening, I reflected upon the elegance and audacity of Holmes' strategy. The household, unaware of the subtle manipulations around them, was playing a role in a drama whose author was unseen. The hollow portrait, the hidden cabinet, the letters, and the boxes all served not merely as physical objects, but as instruments of revelation. And somewhere in the shadows of Ashcombe House, the unseen mind that orchestrated chaos was preparing its next move, oblivious to the fact that the great detective who had long outwitted London's criminals was now 3 steps ahead. The fog that enveloped Baker Street that morning seemed to mirror the growing complexity of the Ashcombe case. The streets were slick and dimly lit, the gas lamps flickering weakly as if uncertain of their duty. Holmes, however, appeared entirely unaffected by the gloom, moving through our sitting room with the precision and focus of a man possessed by a single unyielding purpose. "Watson," he began, not looking up from a set of sketches and notes he had spread across the table, "we have gathered evidence, observed behavior, and traced inconsistencies. Now it is time to act. Observation alone has its limits. Subtlety and orchestration must combine to draw the intruder into revealing himself. We shall construct a trap." I leaned forward, curiosity mingling with apprehension. A trap, Holmes? Do you mean to confront Mr. Marston, or the unknown agent who has been moving within the house? Holmes' eyes gleamed with that familiar intensity. Neither, Watson, nor perhaps both. The trap is psychological as much as physical. We shall use what we know of the household, the false trails we have established, and the predictable reactions of those involved. By controlling perception, we can provoke disclosure. The agent, whoever they are, will expose themselves by their own curiosity, fear, or overconfidence. He spent the better part of the day planning with meticulous care. First, we adjusted the layout of the drawing room and study to suggest the concealment of valuable papers in the cabinet, a subtle exaggeration of its importance. Then Holmes arranged a sequence of minor disturbances. A chair slightly ajar, a window left just so, and the careful placement of letters with cryptic symbols meant to hint at Miss Helena's ongoing presence. "Watson," he said, stepping back and surveying the arrangement, "the key to this plan is patience. The trap is set not with force, but with expectation. The intruder will be guided by the cues we have planted, and in doing so will betray more than their own presence. Every hesitation, glance, and footfall becomes evidence." That evening, we returned to Ashcombe House, ostensibly to continue cataloguing the household's movements. The staff had become accustomed to our presence, and no one suspected the precision of Holmes' orchestration. Miss Fletcher, who now served as our quiet informant, provided subtle insights into the movements of Mr. Marston and the unknown intruder. She noted, for example, that certain servants lingered in corridors longer than necessary, or that faint draughts hinted at recently opened windows and doors. As the house settled into its nightly rhythm, Holmes signalled for me to accompany him to the drawing room. "Observe carefully, Watson," he whispered, "for the next act will commence soon. The intruder, confident in their own cleverness, will believe themselves unobserved, yet every action is anticipated." We waited in the dim light, Holmes' eyes scanning the room and the surrounding corridors. Time passed slowly, each minute stretching taut with tension. Then a faint rustling from the corridor caught our attention, a careful, deliberate movement, intended to be unnoticed. Holmes moved silently toward the doorway, signaling for me to follow. Through the half-open door, we glimpsed the figure of a man, slim, agile, moving with precise caution. He approached the cabinet, pausing to examine the letters and papers we had strategically placed. Holmes observed him without a word, noting the small tremor in his hand and the deliberate avoidance of certain areas we had marked as traps. The man, evidently confident in his own discretion, began to manipulate the cabinet's lock. Holmes leaned closer to me and whispered, "Observe the principle at work. The intruder believes they are in control, yet every movement is constrained by expectation. Each decision they make provides us with evidence." Just as the man opened the cabinet, Holmes stepped forward, his presence suddenly undeniable. "I believe, sir, that you have overstayed your welcome," he said, his voice calm but authoritative. The intruder froze, the lock halfway disengaged, and turned slowly. It was Mr. Marston. His face betrayed a flicker of shock and apprehension, quickly replaced by a mask of composure. "Mr. Holmes, this is hardly what it appears to be," he stammered, attempting to regain his poise. Holmes' eyes never left him, and yet it appears precisely as I have long suspected. Your previous accounts, your inconsistencies, and your attention to the cabinet all converge in this moment. You are, at least in part, responsible for the disturbances and misdirection within this household. Marston's composure faltered further. Yes, I was curious. I meant no harm. I wished only to ensure that the household was secure and the miscellaneous." Holmes interrupted him with a sardonic smile. "Curiosity indeed is a dangerous companion. Your actions, though not overtly criminal, have complicated an already delicate situation. The letters, the false trails, the careful placement of objects, your observations and manipulations have all been noted. And, as you can see, every movement leaves a trace." I could see Marston realizing the trap had succeeded. His gaze flickered around the room, noting the subtle arrangement of objects and letters, the alignment of furniture, and the faint evidence of observation we had deliberately left visible. Holmes had indeed orchestrated a situation in which the intruder revealed himself through his own behavior. Holmes' voice softened slightly, yet retained its sharp edge. "Watson, observe the elegance of such a trap. No force, no confrontation beyond presence. Yet the truth emerges as plainly as the gas lamps illuminate the room. "Mr. Marston, your curiosity has been your undoing." Marston slumped in resignation, realizing the futility of denial. "I did not anticipate. I did not know you could Holmes' eyes gleamed with satisfaction. "Prediction, my dear sir, is not a matter of magic but of observation, logic, and understanding human nature. Every inconsistency, every hesitation, every glance has meaning. And meaning, when read correctly, is evidence of the most incontrovertible kind." As we escorted Marston to a seat and began the process of clarifying his involvement, I could not help but marvel at Holmes' ingenuity. He had set the stage, manipulated perception, and allowed the intruder's own behavior to provide the necessary revelation. The trap was both subtle and profound, a testament to the brilliance of the mind that had orchestrated it. Yet, even in this moment of success, a shadow remained. The true mystery of Miss Helena's disappearance had not been resolved, and the presence of the letters, the hollow portrait, and the hidden cabinet hinted at further layers yet to be uncovered. Holmes, I knew, had only drawn back the first curtain. The events of the previous night left Ashcombe House in a state of quiet tension. The revelation of Mr. Marston's clandestine movements had shaken the household, though none of the servants or even Mr. Ashcombe himself could fully grasp the implications. Miss Fletcher, always keenly observant, seemed to carry the burden of unspoken suspicions, her eyes darting constantly toward the drawing-room, the corridors, and the hollow portrait that had so often been the focus of our investigations. Holmes, as usual, remained composed, though there was a subtle intensity in his gaze that suggested the culmination of a long chain of reasoning. "Watson," he said as we settled into our morning examination of the house, "the case has reached a stage where the evidence, once disparate, begins to converge. The puzzle pieces are now numerous enough, yet sufficiently clear, to allow the mind to perceive the final form." I observed him carefully. "And you believe Miss Helena's disappearance will soon be explained?" Holmes' lips curved in a faint, sardonic smile. "Not merely explained, Watson, reconstructed in every detail. The sequence of events, the motivations, the misdirection, and the psychological manipulations all will reveal themselves when the full panorama is viewed. It is, of course, easier to perceive with 3 steps ahead than to participate without comprehension. Our day was spent retracing the precise movements of every key figure. Mr. Marston, whose curiosity had now been constrained by our awareness, Miss Fletcher, whose observations provided subtle confirmations, and the servants, whose small actions and reactions offered unspoken hints. Holmes paid particular attention to the hollow portrait and its secret compartment, studying the alignment of the frame, the placement of the papers, and the recurring symbols, the crescents that seemed to mark both chronology and intention. "It is the interplay of concealment and revelation," he murmured. "The intruder, or indeed the orchestrator of misdirection, relies upon the assumption that others will interpret absence as randomness. Secrecy is neglect. But the careful observer, Watson, can see intention in every omission and implication in every shadow." By mid-afternoon, Holmes had gathered us all in the drawing-room. Mr. Ashcombe, though visibly anxious, complied, and Miss Fletcher stood nearby, her face pale but resolute. Even Mr. Marston, aware of his previous missteps, had been brought in under the pretext of discussion, though the weight of observation was upon him. Holmes began slowly, almost theatrically, as though conducting a lecture rather than an investigation. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his eyes sweeping the room, "we have all been actors in a drama of concealment, misdirection, and intention. The sequence of events leading to the disappearance of Miss Helena is neither random nor chaotic. It is deliberate, yet subtle, and it is now, at last, possible to perceive the pattern that governs this house." He turned to the portrait, gently lifting it to reveal the hidden cabinet. The papers inside were displayed carefully, each marked with the familiar crescent. "Observe the arrangement of the notes," Holmes continued. "Their dates, initials, and symbols reveal both opportunity and motivation. One might assume that Miss Helena herself left these instructions, yet closer inspection reveals signs of manipulation. Altered sequences, erasures, and the faint traces of a second-hand deliberate, cautious, and guided by knowledge of the house's secret architecture." All eyes turned to Mr. Marston, whose face betrayed a mixture of apprehension and defiance. Holmes gestured toward him. "It is here, in your behavior, that the first true insight is found. Your insistence upon a precise chronology, your avoidance of key corridors, and your curiosity regarding the hidden compartment have all marked you as both participant and observer. Yet your motives, though understandable, were insufficient to conceal the truth. Marston's eyes flickered, and he murmured, almost inaudibly, I only wished to ensure she was safe." Holmes' tone softened slightly, though his gaze remained penetrating. "Indeed, but it is not merely concern for Miss Helena that defines your actions. The hidden compartment and your interest in them reveal the allure of information, the subtle leverage one might wield. Curiosity, compounded by opportunity, has guided your choices, and yet the final truth lies elsewhere, hidden beneath the layers of observation and misdirection." He then turned to Miss Fletcher, who stepped forward hesitantly. Holmes gestured toward the sequence of letters in the cabinet. "You, madam, have observed, recorded, and, through your attention to detail, provided the final confirmations. Your testimony, silent though much of it has been crucial in reconstructing the sequence of events. The unknown agent within the house has acted precisely because they believed the ordinary world would not observe. Yet you did, and your observations align perfectly with the deductions drawn from the evidence. I could see the pieces beginning to coalesce: the papers, the hollow portrait, the false trails, the intrusions, and the minor disturbances, all forming a lattice upon which the truth could be reconstructed." Holmes, his fingers steepled, continued with that measured cadence that so often mesmerized those who listened. "Miss Helena, you will recall, was removed not by malice, but by careful orchestration intended to protect vital information. The secret agent, aware of the value of the documents, manipulated events to ensure her absence while simultaneously attempting to conceal their own identity. Every false trail, every minor disturbance, every mysterious symbol was part of a calculated effort to mislead, confuse, and control perception." He paused, letting the gravity of his words sink in. "The culmination of these observations, the inconsistencies revealed by Mr. Marston, and the careful monitoring of household behavior now allow the complete reconstruction of events. The intruder, confident in concealment, has unknowingly revealed themselves repeatedly. The missing lady, while absent, has remained unharmed, guided by the interventions of both precaution and circumstance." A hushed silence fell. Even Mr. Marston, who had attempted to maintain composure, seemed stunned by the breadth and precision of Holmes' deductions. Miss Fletcher, her face pale but resolute, appeared to grasp the significance of every subtle confirmation Holmes had drawn from her observations. Holmes turned to me, his eyes sharp and deliberate. "Watson, you will appreciate the elegance of the method. Observation, deduction, manipulation, and the orchestration of perception. By guiding both participants and observers through a series of subtle cues, the truth emerges, as inevitably as dawn dispels the fog. Each player, in their own way, has revealed their role. And now we can reconstruct the final events leading to Miss Helena's removal and the motives behind every action within this household." I sat, overwhelmed by the complexity of the case and the meticulous precision of Holmes' reasoning. The layers of deception, the interplay of curiosity and intention, and the subtle orchestration of perception had all led to this moment. The revelation, though not yet complete, was now inevitable, and I sensed that the climactic resolution, the confrontation of the intruder, and the recovery of Miss Helena was but a short step away. The evening of the reveal arrived with an unusual stillness. London's fog had thickened into a dense, almost suffocating pall, blanketing Baker Street and the Ashcombe estate alike. Even the gas lamps struggled to pierce the gloom, lending the house an eerie, almost theatrical atmosphere. Holmes, as was his custom in such moments, was calm, his eyes gleaming with the quiet satisfaction of a mind that has long anticipated the outcome. We gathered the household in the drawing room. Mr. Ashcombe sat stiffly, as though bracing himself for truths he could scarcely imagine. Miss Fletcher stood slightly apart, her hands clasped in front of her, eyes flickering toward the hollow portrait, the cabinet, and the letters we had laid out. Mr. Marston, subdued and uneasy, hovered near the fireplace, aware that his previous evasions had been noted and analyzed. Holmes, seated in his accustomed armchair, steepled his fingers and allowed the silence to deepen. The suspense was palpable. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice measured yet commanding, "we are here to disentangle a web of deception that has encompassed this household disturbed its tranquility, and placed the young lady in temporary absence. The mystery is complex, but every element has been observed, every action catalogued, and every inconsistency noted. What remains is to connect the threads, exposing both motive and method. He rose and walked to the portrait, carefully lifting it to reveal the cabinet. The papers were displayed prominently. The central object of contention, Holmes continued, is not merely the contents of this cabinet, but the desire for knowledge it represents. The secret, carefully concealed, held the power to alter reputations, fortunes, and influence within certain circles. To protect both this information and the individuals connected to it, certain measures were undertaken, measures that involved misdirection, concealment, and calculated intervention. Holmes turned his attention toward Mr. Marston. You, sir, have been involved, though not maliciously. Your curiosity, combined with opportunity, led you to explore the cabinet and the papers therein. Your actions, while revealing of your intentions, were ultimately insufficient to compromise the safety of Miss Helena or the integrity of the household. You observed, hesitated, and even attempted to conceal your knowledge, but the inconsistencies in your statements betrayed you. And yet, you are not the principal agent in this drama. Marston exhaled, relief mingling with lingering apprehension. He inclined his head, as if acknowledging the inevitability of Holmes' deductions. Holmes then turned to Miss Fletcher. Your observations have been invaluable. Though silent for much of this process, your attention to detail, footprints, drafts, reactions of servants, and the subtle cues within this household has provided confirmation of the chain of events and the method of the intruder. Your role, though understated, has been pivotal. All eyes shifted as Holmes moved toward the center of the room, his voice lowering to a near whisper, compelling attention. The true architect of this misdirection, and the individual responsible for Miss Helena's temporary removal, is none other than Mrs. Beatrice Langley, the housekeeper. A collective gasp swept the room. Mrs. Langley, who had maintained an air of composed propriety throughout our visits, turned pale, her hands trembling. Holmes continued, his tone unyielding. Mrs. Langley's motive was not malice, but protective calculation. She had long been aware of certain sensitive documents whose contents, if revealed, could have endangered Miss Helena. Fearing that Miss Marston or another party might access them, she orchestrated the removal of Miss Helena under the guise of absence, manipulated the environment to create false trails, and deliberately drew attention toward Mr. Marston to misdirect suspicion. The housekeeper's composure faltered. I did it to protect her. I feared for her safety. I never intended. Holmes' gaze was sharp, though tempered with understanding. Indeed, your intentions were protective, but the means were complex and, to those unaware, alarming. Your use of misdirection, the letters, the rearrangement of objects, the calculated disturbances served both to shield Miss Helena and to prevent premature discovery of the papers. Each false trail, while seemingly malicious, was a measure of precaution. Your actions were intricate, precise, and driven by both affection and caution. I could see Miss Fletcher exhale softly, relief mingling with astonishment. Even Mr. Marston, though humbled by his own errors, seemed to understand the logic behind Mrs. Langley's intervention. Holmes continued, now addressing the assembled household as a whole. The final sequence of events, then, is as follows. Miss Helena was temporarily removed under careful supervision. The cabinet was monitored to prevent unauthorized access. Mr. Marston's curiosity led him to minor breaches and missteps, which we observed and catalogued. And the household staff, while generally unaware of the orchestration, provided confirmation of patterns and behavior. Every detail, every hesitation, every inconsistency was a fragment of a larger puzzle now resolved. He stepped back, allowing the weight of his words to settle. In short, the mystery was not one of malevolent intent, but of protective vigilance, human curiosity, and the interplay of observation and misdirection. The apparent chaos was, in truth, a carefully orchestrated effort to safeguard both individual and information. The conclusion, though perhaps surprising, reveals the elegance of method and the predictability of human behavior when guided by purpose. Mrs. Langley, now visibly shaken, spoke softly, almost in awe. I only wished to protect her. I did not know anyone could see through it so clearly. Holmes inclined his head. It is not a matter of prescience, but of observation. The human mind leaves traces, even when guided by caution and care. The patterns of intention, when read by a trained eye, reveal the truth as plainly as daylight dispels the fog. And in this case, the fog was not only of London, but of circumstance and careful deception. Miss Helena, who had been led quietly into the room, finally stepped forward. Her face, though pale, bore a hint of a smile. "Holmes, Dr. Watson," she said softly, "I owe you more than words. You have restored not only my safety but the order of this household. I could not have imagined such vigilance or foresight." Holmes, ever modest, inclined his head. "Miss Helena, it is our duty to observe, to interpret, and, when possible, to restore clarity where confusion prevails. The credit lies with those whose actions, though hidden, were guided by conscience and care. Your safety was preserved by foresight, observation, and, above all, intention aligned with purpose." As the household began to relax, a sense of closure settled over Ashcombe House. The hollow portrait remained, now a symbol of protection rather than mystery. The cabinet retained its papers, secure and accounted for, and the individuals involved were reconciled to the careful orchestration that had temporarily disrupted their lives. For my part, I sat back, reflecting upon the elegance of Holmes' deductions. Every misdirection, every minor disturbance, every hesitation and glance had been accounted for. The layers of human behavior, carefully observed and interpreted, had revealed the truth with the clarity of a lantern cutting through London's thickest fog. And, as always, I could not help but marvel at the quiet genius of the man who had, once again, transformed complexity into clarity, chaos into order, and human behavior into evidence. The day following the revelation at Ashcombe House was, for London, a gentle reprieve from the usual pall of fog and smog. The sun struggled through a hazy sky, casting a soft, muted light upon the slick streets, illuminating the city with a cautious warmth. Within the confines of Baker Street, however, the weight of the preceding days still lingered. The case, now resolved in its essential components, had left impressions upon both the household and ourselves that would not soon fade. Holmes moved with his usual deliberate energy, yet there was a subtle lightness in his step of satisfaction, though rarely acknowledged, at the successful unravelling of a particularly intricate puzzle. He examined the notes and sketches we had collected at Ashcombe House, reviewing every detail, cross-referencing each observation, and making the occasional meticulous adjustment. I observed him, fascinated by the precision and dedication with which he continued even after the case had been ostensibly concluded. "Watson," he said abruptly, without looking up, "the brilliance of a case lies not in its drama, but in the subtle orchestration of human behavior, the predictability of intention, and the consistency of evidence. The greatest challenge is seldom in discovering facts, but in discerning significance where others perceive only coincidence." I could not help but nod. The events at Ashcombe House had demonstrated precisely that principle. Every false trail, every subtle disturbance, every hesitation and glance had contributed to the ultimate revelation. It was a testament to Holmes' extraordinary mind that such a complex web of human behavior could be so thoroughly understood and reconstructed. I took a seat near the window, watching the fog slowly dissipate over Baker Street, and reflected upon the lives that had been intertwined with this mystery. Miss Helena had been restored to safety, the papers within the hollow portrait and cabinet remained secure, and even Mr. Marston, though chastened by his own curiosity and errors, seemed to have learned the lesson implicit in Holmes' scrutiny. Miss Fletcher, too, had been vindicated, her observations now recognized as critical to the resolution. It was a rare moment in which the quiet diligence of a faithful observer could be acknowledged alongside the more visible displays of genius. Holmes, noticing my contemplative mood, allowed a faint smile to touch his lips. "Watson, you often dwell upon the moral consequences of these cases, while I am concerned primarily with the mechanisms and principles at work. Yet it is, of course, gratifying when the application of logic coincides with the protection of the innocent. That is the rare confluence where duty, intellect, and morality intersect." I pondered his words carefully. And yet, Holmes, the human element cannot be ignored. Mrs. Langley's actions, though secretive and manipulative, were guided by compassion and concern. Her deception, while troubling to some, preserved Miss Helena's safety. There is, perhaps, A lesson in the interplay of intention and outcome, a reminder that morality and intellect often navigate a delicate balance. Holmes inclined his head slightly. Indeed, Watson, the human mind in all its complexity leaves traces that can be read. Curiosity, fear, and ambition, all these emotions and drives are patterns, susceptible to analysis. The difference between chaos and order lies in perception, in the ability to interpret significance where others see only accident. Our discussion was interrupted by the soft chime of the Baker Street clock, marking the passage of another hour. The ordinary rhythms of life had resumed outside, but within the room the echoes of the Ashcombe case lingered. I could not help but consider the subtle transformations wrought upon the household. Trust had been restored, understanding had been achieved, and the invisible threads of manipulation and protection had been acknowledged. Holmes, having completed his review of the notes, finally turned to me. Watson, the case of the hollow portrait is now concluded, at least in practical terms. Yet, as is often the case, the true fascination lies not in the resolution itself, but in the processes that led us here. Observation, deduction, and the careful orchestration of perception reveal much about human nature, far more than any overt confession or declaration of intent. I nodded in quiet agreement. The elegance of Holmes' reasoning, the subtle interplay of misdirection, observation, and deduction, and the ultimate preservation of both truth and safety provided a rare satisfaction that transcended mere victory. As we prepared to leave Baker Street for a brief reprieve from the fog and pressure of investigation, I glanced once more at Holmes. There was in his expression a combination of fatigue and triumph, though, as always, he made no display of emotion. Yet I, who had long observed him, understood the depth of satisfaction beneath the surface calm. And so, as the City of London carried on unaware of the precise intricacies that had unfolded within Ashcombe House, we reflected upon the case not merely as a series of events, but as a demonstration of the profound capabilities of observation, intellect, and human understanding. The hollow portrait, the hidden cabinet, the false trails, and the carefully orchestrated interventions all served as reminders of the extraordinary complexity inherent in even the most seemingly ordinary circumstances. Holmes, ever the enigma, finally spoke in a tone of rare introspection. Watson, there are lessons here beyond the confines of this house. Human behavior, though unpredictable in its superficial manifestations, follows certain patterns. To discern these patterns, to trace intention through both presence and absence, is to glimpse the architecture of thought itself. And that, my dear fellow, is the true art of deduction. I made no response, for none was needed. In the quiet of Baker Street, the fog beginning to lift, I reflected on the events, the lessons, and the subtle triumphs that had characterized the case. The city outside moved on, but within our minds, the elegance of reason, the triumph of observation, and the satisfaction of resolution endured, an enduring testament to the extraordinary abilities of Sherlock Holmes. The case of the hollow portrait, now fully resolved, left in its wake a rare combination of relief, admiration, and lingering wonder. Ashcombe House had returned to a semblance of normality, though the echoes of recent events seemed to linger in the quiet corridors, in the careful arrangement of furniture, and in the ever-watchful eyes of those who had observed and be observed in turn. Miss Helena, her composure restored, moved with a lightness that belied the days of tension she had endured. Mrs. Langley, though chastened by her exposure, carried herself with dignity, having witnessed the precise logic that had uncovered her well-intentioned subterfuge. Mr. Marston, chastened but enlightened, seemed to understand that curiosity, however natural, must often be tempered by awareness and caution. Holmes, as ever, was his own enigma. At Baker Street he returned to his customary routines, yet there was a quiet satisfaction in his manner, a subtle glow of triumph that he never verbally acknowledged. I observed him carefully, noting the faint relaxation of his features as he reviewed the notes, sketched diagrams, and quietly catalogued each fragment of the case. "Watson," he said one morning, his voice low and contemplative, "there is a certain poetry to cases such as this. The complexity lies not merely in the actions themselves, but in the interplay of perception, intention, and consequence. The human mind leaves traces, deliberate or unconscious, when interpreted correctly, reveal the hidden architecture of events." I nodded, reflecting upon the elegance of his words. Indeed, it had been a remarkable journey from the initial bafflement over Miss Helena's disappearance through the mysterious intrusions and false trails, to the revelation of Mrs. Langley's careful orchestration. Every misstep, every hesitation, and every observation had been a piece of the puzzle, waiting for the discerning mind to assemble into clarity. "Holmes," I said, unable to contain my curiosity, "do you ever tire of such cases? The constant observation, the endless deduction, the subtle manipulation of events?" He smiled faintly, that rare fleeting expression that hinted at both amusement and reflection. "Tire? Perhaps, if one were guided solely by sentiment or desire for ordinary comfort. But the mind, Watson, is never fully at ease until it has apprehended order amidst chaos. Each case is a challenge to perception, a test of inference, and an opportunity to glimpse the elegance of rationality. That, I assure you, is far more invigorating than any ordinary occupation." I leaned back, allowing the weight of his words to settle. Indeed, it seemed to me that Holmes found satisfaction not in acclaim or recognition, but in the very process of unraveling mystery, in the interplay of logic and observation, and in the quiet triumph of intellect over confusion. The hollow portrait itself remained in place within Ashcombe House, a silent sentinel of the events that had transpired. The cabinet retained its papers, secure and accounted for, a testament to both precaution and careful observation. And though the household returned to a routine of domesticity and propriety, the memory of the intricate web of misdirection, curiosity, and protective intervention remained vivid for those who had borne witness. Holmes, having completed his review of notes, finally settled into his chair, pipe in hand, and regarded me with that familiar intensity. "Watson," he said, "it is often the unseen, the subtle, and the overlooked that determine the outcome of events. To observe, to interpret, and to deduce is to perceive the invisible architecture upon which the world rests. That is the essence of our work." I smiled, realizing that, in his modest yet formidable manner, Holmes had imparted yet another lesson not merely in deduction, but in the profound significance of observation, intellect, and human understanding. The city of London outside our windows moved on, unaware of the intricacies we had untangled, yet within our small domain at 221B Baker Street, the echoes of triumph, precision, and revelation remained vivid and enduring. As I prepared my notes for this final record, I reflected upon the extraordinary clarity Holmes had brought to a case that initially seemed opaque and impenetrable. The hollow portrait, the hidden cabinet, the false trails, the orchestrated intrusions, and the human motives revealed in their subtlety all had combined to demonstrate the profound capabilities of observation, intellect, and the delicate balance between human intention and consequence. Holmes, for his part, remained seated, quietly contemplative, a figure of calm genius amid the ordinary bustle of Baker Street, and as the afternoon sun filtered through lingering fog, cast a muted glow upon the room, I realized that, for all its complexity, the case had been resolved not merely through skill, but through patience, understanding, and the relentless pursuit of truth. In that quiet hour, I felt once more the familiar blend of admiration and wonder that always accompanies encounters with Sherlock Holmes. The mystery had been solved, the household restored, and the intricate dance of observation and deduction complete. And yet I knew, as always, that the city and indeed the world would continue to present puzzles that required the keen eye, the subtle mind, and the extraordinary intellect of my singular companion. And so, with the hollow portrait case concluded, we returned to our routines, the fog of London lifting slowly outside, and the brilliance of deduction, observation, and human insight firmly affirmed within the walls of 221B Baker Street.